Well, welcome everyone to this latest edition of the P3 podcast. I am not going to spend any time regarding the introduction today because I want to get straight into it because this guy has got an unbelievable brain and I want to plug into it just for the benefit of you. So today's guest, we're really fortunate to have Professor Greg Whyte with us today. Greg, how are you doing, mate?
I'm very well, thanks, mate. Thanks for having us on.
No, not at all. Really appreciate you being on. Now, I want to get straight into it because these podcasts are about 30 minutes long and I think we could talk for hours, as we did before we come on air, running up 15 or 20 minutes just chewing the fat. So looking at the 2021, reflecting on 2020, how was that year for you on a personal level?
Do you know what? It was probably no different to anybody else's year, and that was very difficult. Multiple levels from a sort of personal family perspective. I've got three children. If we can remember back that far of homeschooling and the trauma of homeschooling for us. I mean, luckily my wife's a teacher. I'm a teacher by training as well, but my wife is exceptional at it, so that definitely helped. But the impact, I think, we underestimate the impact on children actually, and I think they really did take the full brunt of it. Such a formative period where friends are so important, and that interaction is so important for their personal growth. It was difficult from that. I think from a business perspective, exceptionally difficult. Sadly, we had to close my practice on Harley Street for all sorts of different reasons. But when you run a footfall business and you choke off that footfall instantaneously for very long periods of time, it becomes impossible, irrespective of how good your business is, to survive. It was indifferent, but I think we learned a lot. And I think from a personal perspective, there's quite a lot of personal growth through that. I always run the mantra that there's no such thing as failure, just failure to learn. And I think if I look back on it, I think what did I learn from that process, and how am I going to use that in the future to grow? So it is what it is.
Yeah, and I think if you don't mind, we'll dig a little bit more into that, because you and I are both, client facing. We go out there, we do our consultancy, our coaching and all that in very similar fields, albeit at different levels. And it's really important for ourselves to reflect and learn and model what we're saying, and what we're teaching and what we're engaging in conversation. So what was that biggest learning point for you during 2020 then?
I think probably the biggest learning point was interesting because it runs into something I'm sure we'll chat about, a sort of new project that we're launching in the new year this year. And that is around really understanding how far people have to move. And actually about I think to some extent you can get sort of lost in this idea that everybody is within your silo. But there are so many silos, and actually many people, when it comes to things like what I do around physical activity and health, I think it just reiterated, shone a spotlight on me for me on how far an awful lot of people are off of the point of running a healthy lifestyle. And I think what that did is not necessarily sort of pointing the finger at them. It's actually pointing the finger at me to say, actually, what we should be developing are interventions and procedures and frameworks and approaches that address those people specifically. I think it's all too easy just to go down the sort of mainstream middle of the road and assume that that's going to pick up everybody, because it really doesn't. And I think what COVID did is actually shone a spotlight on that, and it shone a spotlight critically on for me on a number of different areas. I think number one is that the socio-economic inequality that we have in our population. I mean, Britain is probably the most hierarchical country in the world, I think, when it comes to class. And I think what we saw through last year was we saw a widening of that socio-economic divide. But what's interesting in that is that if you link that into things like health, what we do know is that at the lower socioeconomic demographic end of that spectrum is where you have the greatest incidence of things like obesity, type 2 diabetes, inactivity, etc. And so what we saw is not only a widening in terms of money, we actually saw a widening in terms of health, is that health inequality grew. And I think, interestingly, I do some work. I sit on the advisory board for a charity called Her Spirit that works specifically within women. And I think what's interesting there is that the gender gap, that there existed a gender gap in terms of health between men and women, particularly actually around physical activity, a significant gender gap. And that gender gap grew throughout 2020. And I think that, that's something that's really interesting. I think something that I've learned from that is that what we do need to do is focus our approaches much more specifically, be much more bespoke about the people that we are talking to if we're going to get real change.
Yeah, so there's, I suppose, what I was thinking there as you were chatting was around, you can provide the opportunity, but some people are not in the right place, or even in, have that background of being able to get themselves, get the trainers on is always the most difficult thing, is the quote, isn't it?
Yeah.
And is that still the same thing when you're talking about those gaps between them? Is it a case of just getting started and doing something rather than nothing?
I think you're absolutely right. I think behavior is incredibly complex. And I think probably the most difficult thing to do is change behavior, both on a personal level, but also, as a leader, as a business leader, to change the behavior of your staff, to change the behavior of an industry is incredibly difficult to do. And I think that the way in which we do that, I mean, certainly from an individual perspective, is there's an awful lot of psychology within that. I think it's not just about providing the facilities, albeit the facilities are really important. It's not just about time. I mean, it's interesting when you look at sort of the hierarchy of excuses for not changing. People will always put time at the very top, and we've spoken about this before. But I do think it's just recognizing that behavior change is incredibly difficult to achieve. You've got to be robust and resilient in continuing to try to make that change. But I think as well, what you've got to be is flexible. Is that what works for one person isn't going to work for all. And it's just, making sure you make that individualized sort of bespoke approach.
I think so. You took the words right out of my mouth, and I think that bespoke, personalized approach helps it resonate with the individual more. So they're more likely to buy into it, they own it, and therefore they're more likely to see it through until those new habits are formed. Because I think we could be really prescriptive, maybe when we haven't got the confidence in ourselves, or maybe the breadth or depth of knowledge in terms of our skill set to be able to provide the right tool at that time. And I think to then say, well, actually, here's a gym membership, have it for 6 months, but if you don't go, then we're not renewing it for you. So that's government funding, should we call it? It's never going to work, because we need to get into that person's head and help them, support them in their world, don't we? What's your barrier to you getting there? And let's co-create those solutions to move forward.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And I think, there are, again, it sort of runs us back to that idea of the middle of the road. I mean, you highlight the gym, which is a really interesting one, because I think, one of the critical issues is that actually having the confidence, and the confidence sort of is underpinned by conditioning, but it's also that self-esteem issue, to go to the gym in the first place. There is a body of work to get people from the couch to the front door, from the front door to the gym. It's not simply about, fitting a new swimming pool, having the latest equipment, or making it 50% cheaper. It is about, and it's on an individual basis. How does that individual make the changes required to actually go and go to the gym? Not only join the gym, there's another classic, but actually join the gym and participate at the gym.
Yeah, to make it affordable. And I think sometimes I don't know if it's a human nature thing, or certainly just my experience with people I work with, and I've even done it myself, where we want some quick wins, don't we? We want that quick results. So yeah, I've joined for 3 months. I didn't really enjoy it. The gym was rubbish. The environment wasn't right. It wasn't for me. Rather than, let's have a long-term goal. And right, I've never been a gym bunny. I've never been into sport. So actually, in 2 years' time, I'm going to join a gym. So in January 2023, I'm going to join the gym. So that means in January 21, I need to make sure that I'm leaving the house and going for a nice active walk 3 times a week to get myself active, to condition myself, and then we can build that up to maybe going for a group walk. So I join a club, a walking club, or whatever it needs to be. We have to break ourselves in and have that long-term strategy, where I think as a nation, we tend to be short-sighted and just deal with the crocodile closest to the boat.
Yeah, I think I would say that, that's just as humans. We're looking for the shortcut. I mean, I don't think that's a unique issue in the UK. I mean, I think if you look internationally, the same problem exists in a number of places internationally, particularly with things like inactivity. And I think you're absolutely right. It is, and it comes back to what we've spoken about before, about goal setting. And it's, I think sometimes we sort of think it's a throwaway comment, oh, we'll set some goals, but actually setting goals is really critical if you're going to reach that long-term goal. But I think on top of that is the way in which you set those goals. So there are various different sort of standards that you can use for setting goals, but certainly one of those things is actually about it being timely. Is that you've got to think to yourself, how long is it going to get to the end point? How much time do I need to deliver this? And I think when you are talking about lifestyle change, in whatever guise, from an individual to a business perspective, it takes time. What you can't do is you can't rush it. And the problem is if you rush it, it's that classic. You think about, we're talking now in New Year. The average New Year's resolution lasts 21 days. And I would say the primary reason for that is because of timing. Is that we wake up on New Year's Day and we say, right, I'm going to lose 3 stone by the end of January. And what you do know is that unless you're going to remove a limb, that is never going to happen. And so what happens is, 7, 14, 21 days in, you stand on the scales, you've lost a pound, and you're thinking, oh, it's lost. Instead of actually, and the problem is, it's not you that's the problem, it's the goal that is the problem. It's what you're trying to achieve. And so really what we should be doing, and it goes back to our idea of reflection, is that reflecting back on success or failure gives you the opportunity to see why it wasn't successful, if it wasn't successful. But critically as well, I think what often we don't do is actually reflect on success. We sometimes move on too quickly, and I think actually reflecting on success can be as valuable as reflecting on failure. And in doing that, what you can then do is you can then mold and adapt those goals to make sure that you keep moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I think so. And the term we use is alignment with your goals. So it's obviously it's really, really important to have goals absolutely all day long. But what I find sometimes is I go, right, this is what you want to achieve. Great. Let's define that. What's it look like? And what do you think the best way to do it is? And more often than not, the first, second, third option they have of the best plan to get there is not the right one for them. And that's them coming up with that solution. So for example, sort of linking back to what we were talking about earlier, somebody wanted to lose weight, their automatic response, because maybe we're programmed that way, is, well, I need to join a gym. Okay, so we write it down as an option and go, well, you've never gone to a gym in your life. So is that really going to work now? So that alignment is almost, it's at a dog leg already. So the alignment might be, well, actually, it's a bit more, go back to the achievable and timely, is what's that mean to you? Well, because you're already creating barriers to achieving your goal. So let's get some alignment of what it is you want to achieve, make sure it's realistic, but also agree on that path that's best for you to get there. Yeah,
it's interesting that realism really is quite important. I think being realistic, because obviously, what I've used it. I mean, interestingly, last year, I started off just pre-lockdown. Is I worked with a client, an American client, lovely fella, Kyle Vogt, his name was, and we broke the world record for 7 marathons on 7 continents. And if you can believe it, we actually did it in 81 hours, which included running the 7 marathons. And I think what was interesting about that is that when I work on challenges like that, it's actually about the structure of the planning that's required in order to deliver that. And generally, they're in the timeliness is my biggest challenge, because people often, they say, oh, I want to do this in 6 months' time, and you think, ideally you'd have 18 months preparation for that. So I think the point is that it is possible to do it, but what you've got to think to yourself is that there's a lot more hardship if you're going to do it in a short time. So when it comes to things like weight management, is that weight management requires physical activity, diet, very importantly, and then things like alcohol. And so what you're going to do in the early new year, if you're going to do it quickly, you've got to make big changes to an awful lot of your lifestyle, which makes it much more difficult to do, much more difficult to sustain. Yeah. Now, if you can sustain it, you can get those rewards rapidly. But the key issue is that most people struggle with making multiple lifestyle changes simultaneously. That's the big issue. And so I think you're right. I mean, and exactly what you do is exactly what I do. And I think often having the guidance of a professional really is very valuable, because what they do is that they just enable you to unpick it and make sure that you've got the right structure and the right planning and the right process in place in order to deliver. And that for me is the key to it.
Yeah, and those true professionals, I think, are the ones that, ironically, they're there to get themselves out of a job, if that makes sense. That you know, within a few weeks, potentially maybe a couple of months, that you shouldn't need the support. You know what works for you because you've owned it. but they're there from a remote perspective as support if you have a little blip or drop. But it's one more check-in, 6, 12 months, 18 months down the line, check in, what you're doing differently, gone off the rails a little bit, right? Let's have a chat around this. What can we do? And off you go again on your merry way.
And do you know what? It's a great acid test for people. If you're thinking about working with anybody, whatever it is, what you should always test is the redundancy theory. And that is that the person who is supporting you should be looking at the point at which they're no longer going to support you.
Yeah.
If you have a conversation with somebody and they say, yeah, in 2 years' time, we'll try this, you've got to start thinking to yourself, they're probably the wrong person to be with.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that you won't be with them in 2 years' time, but in 2 years' time, they should be doing something else. Because if they haven't evoked the change that you're looking for at this specific time, in that period of time, I mean, I see that classically, in my practice, the classic was, well, I won't tell you who it was, but he came in, he said he'd been seeing a physiotherapist twice a week for a year. And I said to him, has he got any better? He said, no. And I said to him, why are you still seeing him? He said, I don't know. I said, I thought I had to. And it's like, because he'd been indoctrinated into the process that actually it will get better eventually. You just got to keep coming to see me.
Yeah.
And I think you've got to be canny enough to really sort of reflect on it and think, to my mind, I always work on the concept that I will be redundant. And so I'm working myself into a position of no job. But that's what you should be looking for in people, I think.
Of course it is. And I think, when you're working with big organizations, whenever we're putting a proposal in, the back end of that initial proposal is we need to start building your internal muscle, with your internal capability, so that, they're on our shoulders at some point, and then all of a sudden they can take over and we can withdraw and we can move on to the next project and you're up and running. Because if you constantly got that codependency, you'll never be able to stand on your own 2 feet. And we've got to be clear of that from the start, I think, from expectations.
Well, so it's interesting you say that, because I talk an awful lot about intrinsic motivation. People talk, we talk ad infinitum about motivation, but I always say, the most important motivation is what people have inside them. We can have extrinsic motivation, so you can have a guys like you and I standing by the side of them, supporting them. Equally, you can build in extrinsic motivators, so rewards and prizes, etc. But when push comes to shove, if you're going to be successful in the long term, it's intrinsic motivation that is most important. And if you're working with people who build that intrinsic motivation, that's exactly who you should be with.
Yeah, and I think that really chimes with what we're talking about here, because you've got to, if you're working with good externals, they'll light that spark. They'll like, whether it's a learning culture, a coaching culture, performance culture, just a common decency, be human approach in work of saying good morning. They've got to want to do that themselves and see the benefit of it, and at some point, if you're not there and you've not done that, then I said the whole system falls down. And actually, as a coach, trainer, consultant, teacher, whatever, actually, it doesn't bode well on you if they can't stand on their own 2 feet.
No, they are fundamentally, they are your advert.
Absolutely, they are.
I mean, that's the point, and I mean, it really is the point. But it's an interesting one. I think there is that fear of people who work in sort of our sector. There is a fear of not being in work, and so what they do is that they don't necessarily build in that redundancy. But I think as a buyer of the service, I think certainly one of the acid tests should be looking at that. That should be one of your tests of the value of what you're getting.
For sure. And I think that I've heard a couple of things you talking about, and one of your mantras in particular is that nothing good comes easy, and I think there's a lot of truth in that, because change is difficult for us human beings. Doing something new is different. And actually, dare I say it, success is different, because it's all about that consistency of effort. Consistency is difficult. Yeah,
without any shadow of doubt. And I think if last year taught us anything, it was actually about, and I think it's a word that's a little bit overused in business, is resilience. I don't think we describe it that well, but I think resilience is that ability to keep going despite what appears to be a negative environment. And I think that's the key to it. Is often we don't often test our resilience, because we live in a nice Western society, fairly affluent, and it's no real resilience. Whereas I think last year, it really did test people's resilience, and I think that, and there's a value to that. But certainly, without any shadow of doubt, nothing good comes easy. And also, I think sort of another mantra I always talk about is that nothing great was ever achieved alone. And I think making sure you've got the right team around you is important in that resilience piece. It's important in that progress piece. It's because we all need support, whatever level we're at, whatever we're trying to achieve. Having the right network and the right team around us is absolutely fundamental.
With that though, I think you need, as a leader, manager, business owner, whatever you are listening to this podcast, is you need a little bit of humility there to say, I need some help and support you. You know, things are not quite right, or if they are okay, they could be so much better if I just open my arms and let people in.
Yeah, I tell you, it's interesting you bring that up, because I just, towards the end of last year, I worked with children in need and Joe Wicks on his challenge for children in need, a 24-hour PE lesson. It was great. It was great fun, actually. But I think I was chatting with him, and then following that, I had a conversation with a whole host of other people. And the one thing that came out the back of that as a leader is trust. And I think that's the fundamental to everything that we do, is that Joe trusted me that what I was doing for him was the right thing that would get him to the end of that 24-hour period. If I look back at people like Davina or David Williams or John Bishop and those guys, fundamentally it comes down to trust. And I think that trust is not won by saying I am always right. You do what I say, I'm right. It's not about that. It's actually about, as you say, it's about that humility piece. And it's also about putting your hands up. We don't always get it right. And I think putting your hands up and saying, look, I got it wrong. We should have done it a slightly different way, or I could have done it a slightly different way, I think is really important. I think the other thing is actually to make sure that you act on feedback. I think I see far too many people who ask for feedback and then ignore it. It's like, well, don't ask for feedback if you don't want it and you're not going to do anything with it. Because I think, again, that comes down to trust. Because if people give you feedback and then they see you acting on it, or at least see you considering it, and then giving a response which tells them why you're not going to act on it, I think that is all part of this process of building trust. And I think if you build trust in the people that are around you, it's much easier to affect change, because people are coming with you and they will buy into what you're trying to achieve. And so, as you said, that coupled with, of course, communication, and great communication makes such a difference, is that tell people what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve, so that you do get that buy-in. And then behavior change, it comes along with that. I think when it comes to health and well-being and fitness, for example, I think one of the biggest problems we've got is that we've got a pointy finger approach. The obesity message just basically vilifies people who are overweight. It's not overly helpful when you point the finger saying you do this, you do this, you do this, and it's no way to lead. I think there's something to be learned from that.
Yeah, and again, that really resonates with our approach, because actually there's very few clients we work with that, sometimes the board or the chief exec will say, right, you need to sort that department out. And I'll say, yeah, yes, fine, we'll go in and work with them. I can't promise we'll sort them out, but we'll work with them. But we're starting with you, and then that's almost the acid test, because if they're not willing to be vulnerable and work and collaborate with us and create that alignment again, because the part of the problem, what we see sometimes, and I don't know if you see this, Greg, is the lack of clarity on what we're trying to achieve here. What's the intent? Tell me what you're trying to achieve. So it could be, right, it's December now. A lot of organizations are working towards their plans for next year, and a lot of them are doing their end of year closeout, and they're starting to think about what they want to achieve next year. And by the time they get to that, it'll be January, February, March, and then they have their mission statements or their goals set in March. They've lost a quarter of the year.
Yeah.
So that clarity intent is, right, next year we need to raise this much revenue or get this much profit. That's fine. People can understand that. Then the next conversation from that effective leader is, so how are we going to do that, guys?
Yeah.
And then get their buy-in and their ownership, because they'll have all the solutions. And
also, I think what was interesting, I think, about last year is it shone a spotlight on that issue of business by spreadsheet. Right, what our goals next year are to raise profit by this much, to earn this much. And you sort of think, well, that's it's a goal. Yes, it's a line in the sand. Yes, it's somewhere we're trying to achieve. But the real question is why? Why are we doing that? We've got a multi-million-pound business turning over multi-million pounds, and there is a requirement. I mean, and it's a really capitalist approach that it's never enough. And I think that's, in essence, that's what capitalism is, and it's not always a problem. But I think that when you are asking people to work much harder for a gain in the overall organization, the overall structure, and particularly the people that reside above them, there has to be a reason why they should do that.
Yeah.
And I think it's not good enough just to say to people, you know, I want you to do this because we need to raise more money. You've got to say, why is that? You know, what is that money going to do? It's going to improve the service that you give to the customer. The customer's going to be happier. We're going to make a greater difference to like, you know, et cetera, et cetera. There are lots of different reasons why it could be. But I think it's about articulate. It's like me, you know, working with somebody saying, I just want you to be healthier. What does that mean? Why do you want me to be healthy? I'm actually, you know, I mean, some of the clients I see, you know, they're happy. You know, why would I want to be healthiher? Well, because, you know, it's the explanation of the long-term implications of the lifestyle they're currently leading. And that can be linked to money. It can be linked to productivity, but equally it can be linked to long-term health outcomes and quality of life in later life. Now you're investing into the future.
Yeah.
But I think having an understanding of why is much more important than having an understanding of what.
I couldn't agree more. And I think this is why, you know, the rule book of business has been ripped up the last 10, 15, 20 years with the likes of, you know, your big fintech companies, your Facebooks, your Google and all that. From afar, it looks like, you know, it's so flexible. Just come in when you want, do what you want. You know, it's fine to sit on a beanbag, have a milkshake. It's all fine. Well, actually, there's a core ethic of business in there. And a lot of the people that work there and certainly are loyal to the business then get offered shares. So they've got skin in the game. They get told what they're going to do if they get that growth. So if we're going to go from whatever numbers they're on, they're probably on gazillion turnover now, aren't they? You know, if we make X amount, what we're going to do is we're going to pump another 50 million into employee welfare, which means we'll be able to build this campus, build this, build that. We'll be able to give this much to charities. We'll have a positive impact on that. We'll do this for the environment. So everyone's like, I'm in. I'll do a bit of discretionary effort there because everybody's going to win. Rather than the olden days where the organization was, no, you will work longer because we're paying you that. By the way, we're not paying you overtime, but the company's hit its target and therefore the board are happier and then the shareholders are happier.
Yeah.
There's too much of a disconnect, isn't it?
And what's interesting, you know, as you're speaking there, what is interesting, and you'll tell me better than I know, but certainly one of the things that I noticed from last year was the instant migration to home working. And fundamentally, what to my mind, I looked at that and I thought the one thing that they're testing here is trust. And I think prior to lockdown, in March of last year, you know, what most businesses would have said is, no, we're not going to allow that because we don't trust our workers to do the work at home. And of course, suddenly they're forced to do that. They've got no choice. And so therefore it happens. And then lo and behold, you can trust your workers. And then actually, you know, I did a number of projects last year with some very big firms. One of the biggest problems was this idea of living at work. You know, we actually coined it, living at work. And one of the big problems with that were people overworking. It wasn't an underwork issue, it was an overwork issue. And so therefore you got issues around mental and emotional health, around physical health, around burnout. And I think what that came down to fundamentally is you look at, you know, you just described, you know, the way they approach it in places like Google and Microsoft, etc. But it's about trust. Is that they actually, come in and sit on a beanbag, but we trust you to do the work that is set to you, and you will achieve that goal. And I think if COVID achieved anything that was positive, I think what it has done is change mentality of trust within the workforce.
Couldn't agree more. It forced boards to react, because before it was a board level, you know, where, you know, bloody hell, remember trying to get dressed down Friday through a board committee. No, we're still in suits on a Friday. It's like, well, we're not client facing. We're just in an office working together. You know, we perform better. Everything's relaxed. It's nice. We've got common ground. You start seeing people's personalities. So therefore you see what they tend to wear outside of work. You build trust. It's topic of conversation. Somebody, God forbid, could wear a rugby shirt on a Friday and go, I didn't know you supported them. Let's have a chat, you know, and it gives you things to talk about. But one of my clients, an executive leadership team, is probably the most high-end performing, functioning team that responded the best to COVID. And do you know what they did as a priority? Within the first 2 weeks, there was not one conversation around goals, targets, performance. It was all about welfare. How are you doing? How are you doing? Is the family okay? Have you got the right setup at home? Is there anything you need from us? Is your computer working okay? Do you need better internet? Right, okay. Have you checked in with your team? Can you make sure you do a welfare call to make sure they're okay? Because if there's any issues, you report straight to the MD. You know, and it was all about settling down. And within 2 or 3 weeks, they were off and everybody was happy. And then we had these checkpoints where we were doing welfare check-ins, we were calling them as a leadership and management team. Just pick up the phone or get on, because everyone's getting zoomed out a little bit, aren't they? Pick up the phone and have an old school chat around, hey, how you doing? Everything okay?
Yeah. I tell you what that strikes as well is something that you know, that I've worked in a number of big businesses around, and that is this sort of differential between absenteeism and presenteeism. Is that I think what lockdown did for many people is that actually, because they were living at work, there was a real fear of moving away from the desk. It was, you know, because everyone's on constantly, and so what you did is you drove down absenteeism. And to some extent, that's a very easy thing to achieve, because it's very easy to point the finger who's somebody who's absent, and you can reward, you know, lower absenteeism by, you know, through monetary awards or whatever it is. So it's very easy to get people at work. The key, though, is about presenteeism, is to make them as productive as possible when they are there. And I think some people, I still come across, you know, some firms that I've worked with who don't quite see the distinction. But what's interesting enough, I did a big project last year with a law firm. What was interesting with them, it was increasing physical activity in the workplace. And I remember it distinctly. The first conversation I had with them was that lawyers earn money sat in front of a computer. You know, that's the nature of their business. And I was trying to promote more physical activity. Now that meant potentially more time away from the desk. And you can imagine that the pushback from that was, hold on a minute, that's going to change productivity instantly because they're not at the desk. And I said, no, what it will do is it'll improve productivity when they are at the desk. It improves presenteeism. So they might be absent a little bit more because they might not be sat at their desk, but when they're at their desk, they'll be much more productive, because they you know, we're going to eliminate things, or certainly reduce issues like low back pain or mental health issues and all those type of things. And what was great about it, after it was a 9-month project, and I remember at the Lawyer of the Year Awards, they actually won Best Health Intervention at the Lawyer of the Year Awards. And I sat next to the CEO, who was the former CFO. And I said to him, how did the numbers look? And he sort of, that little wry smile, and he said, yeah, he said productivity was up. And they calculated something like 5 to 10% less time at the desk, less time at their computer, and yet productivity had risen. So I think what's really important in that is actually if you create the right environment for people, they become more productive, and there's less pressure on that, what we would perceive to be the only way of increasing productivity.
Yeah, and I think so. I think it's absolutely spot on, and I think that organizations are so sort of hell-bent on measuring everything to the nth degree now. They don't ask themselves, what are they measuring and why are they measuring it? You know, so if it's a case of clocking in and clocking out, right, our average working hour was 9 a.m. till 9 p.m. That's not something to be proud of.
No.
You don't know that person could be playing solitaire for 3 hours with their screen up, waiting for the boss to go home, just because I think I need to be here as long as the boss is here. And I've actually seen this. Or I've seen bizarre behavior where somebody's having a conversation with me and they go, give me a second. They go back to the computer and they wiggle their mouse. And I went, what was that for? And they went, oh, because my instant messenger would have gone to sleep and people wouldn't know I was here. So they start thinking, if my instant messenger is on, I'm not on my desk. I went, so what do you do when you go to the toilet? Do you run to the toilet to get back before it falls asleep? Likewise, if you're not there and you're awake and you're not answering, then people think you're being rude. So it just rolls on to this bizarre, unproductive, unhealthy behavior, because that's causing stress for that individual. You know, in terms of that presenteeism.
Well, it's affecting the individual stress. It affects team stress. It affects industry stress. You know, and at the same time, is it changing productivity? Yes, it is. It's reducing productivity, because people spend more time worrying about the perception of others than they do on actually delivering the job. And that, you know, I mean, you know, obviously my area is slightly different, but it's so important that you're doing it for yourself.
And I think we're coming on to probably one of our latter subjects for the podcast, where I want to talk about, you know, corporate health, and certainly the corporate health environment, where I did a little sort of a little small sort of study with one of my executive boards I'm working with, where they were on the verge of burnout. There's no doubt about that. You know, stressful time, picking up things like, I've had no leave this year, I've had 1 week's leave, and you know, but it wasn't sort of, I call it a busy badge or a hero badge. You know, I've got a hero badge, I haven't had to leave this year. And I'm like, okay, so that's poor time management then, right? And they're like, what? Nobody's challenged them. No manager or leader's gone, I've noticed you haven't had any time off this year. Are you okay? Is everything all right? And I asked them to go, right, this week, go and do something that makes you happy. What do you enjoy? Plug back into that. And a lot of them do, just morning walks before work. So don't open your laptop till 9 a.m. Some of them are waking up, having their morning coffee in their PJs at 6:30, 7 a.m. And next thing you know, it's 11 a.m. They haven't had breakfast. The dog hasn't gone for a walk. The kids have got to school somehow. They didn't even know how that's happened. They just lost all senses. And I was like, right, what I'm going to ask you to do for a month is just to be more selfish. And they went, oh, we can't be selfish. It's not a good thing. I went, no. Be more selfish so that you look after yourself. Therefore, you have more energy to look after more people. I'm not asking you to be selfish for 24 hours of the day. Just give yourself 20, 30 minutes for me time, whatever that is. And that could well be the school commute. Allow yourself to do the school trip before starting work, because and watch your children as they go to school, and watch the smile on their face as they interact with other kids, and reflect on that while driving home, rather than thinking, right, I need to get back now. I need to get back to that email, get on that project. Just be a bit more present. Is that something that resonates with you?
I think, and again, as you're saying that's, you look at 2020 as a year, and I would say that the highlight, the light was completely shone on this area of mental and emotional health. Something that became part of the genre, of the era, something that was a taboo subject prior to that. And I think it really did highlight the key issue. And actually, to some extent, it highlighted an important thing for me, and that is that we are a social animal. And actually our ability to interact with others is really, really important. And I don't know if you remember back to it, but March and April, the virtual meetings were like the panacea. They were the solution. And of course, as the year went on, they sort of waned and people just got absolutely sick of doing them. And it's because it's not personal. There is no social interaction really on that. Having the screen on does help, but even then, the bottom line is it's just a phone call. We like people, we like to be around people. We are a social animal, and I think also physical contact in that was really important. And I think sometimes we sort of forget that importance because we rush to work, we get to our desk as quickly as we can, we smash out as much work as we possibly can. We have a half-hour lunch break, but we don't get up from our seat. We actually have it at the desk so we can carry on. And then once we finish, we have to rush back because we're running late and X and Y. And I think we forget about ourselves. And I think you're right. I think actually being a little bit, and it's selfish is an interesting word, isn't it? Because it's got particular connotations. But I think it's about being more self-aware of yourself, not self-aware of others, self-aware of you and what you're going through and how you're responding. Because I think that is something that fundamentally obviously underpins productivity at work, but equally it's productivity at home. It's happiness, it's interaction with your family, it is being fundamentally a nice person. And so I think actually being much more self-aware, 2020 should have shone the spotlight on that for many people to make sure they do look after themselves. And hopefully businesses have sort of recognized that as well.
Yeah, definitely. And tying nicely into that self-awareness is that level of self-regard. And I think that's what ties into what we're talking about, this physical and mental health, that make sure you're looking after yourself. It's the old adage of, being on a plane, you put your own oxygen mask on first before you help other people, because if you don't do that, then you can't help anybody. You might help the person next to you, but that's it. But then you're going to suffer. So let's make sure that we sort of put ourselves first to a certain degree. Because of course we can be that natural altruistic person that's all about rescuing and saving everybody else. And then we burn ourselves out that way as well, don't we? Where sometimes you've got to reverse engineer that.
No, I think you're definitely right. And I think actually, it's that, I think what we have to remember is that big things can be achieved by small changes. And I think being a little bit more self-aware, looking after yourself a little bit more, it doesn't require massive change. It's small things. I mean, if you imagine, for example, the average office worker, and this was interesting. I did something with lockdown on this. The average office worker sits down for 9 to 10 hours a day. That is 3/4 of their waking life sat down. And that has got profoundly negative connotations for physical, mental, and emotional health. Ironically, I mean, I worked with some people last year during lockdown, and believe it or not, there were some people I worked with who did less than 100 steps a day. Because what they did is they got out of bed, they took the stairs down into their office, they sat at their office till lunchtime, they walked to the kitchen, walked back to the office, and then walked to the sofa, and then walked back to bed. And you sort of think, well, that is, it's one end of that spectrum, but actually there's an awful lot of people who will get to work, they'll drive around the car park until they can find the closest spot to the door. They walk to their desk and sit down, and they're there for 9-10 hours plus, and then they get back in their car, they drive home. I call it, I'm sure we've chatted about this before, but I call it the box culture. So that they get in their box, they drive their box to work, they sit in front of their box at work, they get back in their car in their box to drive home, and then they go home and sit on the sofa in front of the box. And I think what you've got to think to yourself is that just small changes in that. So, at lunchtime, going out for a lunchtime walk in the great outdoors, a little bit of natural light exposure, changing things like vitamin D, and actually making it social. So walking with somebody else. It's not a big imposition on your lifestyle. It doesn't really affect business, but my God, it will have such a profound effect on your health. Because it's a small change from what is a very low level, a sort of a low bar. And so I think people, rather than thinking to yourself, I've got to wear spandex and join a very expensive gym, to my mind, it's not about that. And much of sort of the new things that we're launching this January are based around those small steps to achieve big aims.
Yeah, it makes such a difference. And I'll just share a little story with you that one of my clients in the city of London, a couple of the guys there, what they would define themselves, and I'm probably one to be fair, a coffee snob. So they like particular good coffee, and it's something to do with probably cycling, certainly the triathlon world.
Yeah.
And their best independent coffee shop, because they wanted to support them, was a 10-minute walk away from the office. And we can never quite get there, so we have to use maybe one of the major chains around the corner. So I said, why can't you get there? It's just 10-minute walk. So imagine that. They're 5 minutes to get your coffee, 10-minute walk back, that's 25. Or do you have your business meeting where you're walking all the way there, talking, get your coffee, go round to the local park, sit, God forbid, sit on a lunchtime in the fresh air, vitamin D. Imagine that. Stopping, taking in the river, and coming back, and you'd probably solve most of your problems, 2, 3, 4 of you. So that's what they did religiously 3 times a week. Monday, Wednesday, Friday was their coffee hour. And they ended up sort of creating a bit of a movement where, 5, 6, 7 went, got the benefits of it. But what we found as well was, I don't know if you see this, is walking and talking is so good for the soul because it's non-confrontational. You're not sat across the desk. You're not sat in a meeting room. You're actually walking side by side, and therefore you'll talk a little bit more freely. So we found that they had richer, deeper conversations by getting outside and walking and talking, and obviously all the other benefits that we've discussed.
It's intriguing, isn't it? And I think what also happens then is that you get cultural change. And I think, again, if we think back to lockdown, I mean, I certainly want, for me, one of the things that we do very badly is planning when it comes to this sort of this. I mean, physical activity, health promotion, behavior change. We just don't plan it. And in fact, if you put in your diary 12 to 1 lunch, then that's where you are.
Yeah.
People won't hassle you, and if they do hassle you, they need to get a life. But you sort of change that culture, because now actually, and if you're out of the office, you can't answer the email, and you can't answer your phone because you're not in office, and you shouldn't be there because it is lunch break. And then what suddenly happens is that everybody else starts to see that and think, oh, that's a really good thing. Because when they come back from lunch, all of a sudden they're so much more productive and they get things smashed out. It's incredible. And they're in a better mood and they smile a bit more, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think, what underpins all of that is actually planning. I think let people know, communicate to people what's going on. And it does make a big difference. But I think invariably what we try, it's almost like what we do is we think, oh, that we shouldn't tell anybody about that. Let's not tell anybody about that. We're sort of doing something for ourselves, that we're actually going to go and have a coffee or have some lunch or go and have a talk. Let's not tell anybody. And if I don't put it in my diary, nobody will know. And it's like, so it becomes subversive then, and it's counterproductive.
God forbid anybody's proactive and they think, right, during my lunch hour, I'm going to nip to the local shop because I need to pick something up for my other half's birthday and bring it back to the office because I'll get judged on that. You've gone shopping in work's time? No, I've gone shopping in my lunch break, which saves me having to come all the way back into the city on the weekend. So that's how I've used it productively, rather than being prejudged and these rules made up that create the culture. But it makes me think how strong was that command and control culture of that organization for people to perceive the situation to be like that? And until you talk about it, though, going back to what we talked about right at the start, and iron out that intent and the expected behaviors and the open culture that a lot of companies are striving for now, it's really difficult to change that, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I sort of think about it when I work with elite sport, and I think one of the most difficult things in elite sport to do is to get athletes to recover. Now you sort of think, well, that's ridiculous. Of course they'll recover. They don't, because and it is the same as the business model, and that is that the pressure is from the top down. Because in sport it's about funding. Funding follows medals, and so it's all about medals. And how do you win medals? You win medals by training hard and long and continually. And so then that drips down from the very top, from the funders into the performance directors, into the coaches, into the athletes. And so because of that, what you do is you set a culture that runs across the organization, which is you must be training all the time. You must be working all the time. And of course, what elite sport, it's a wonderful analogy, because actually in sport, what we know is that adaptation, it runs this thing called a supercompensation cycle. So basically what you do is you induce stress, and with that stress, you get a reduction in performance. But once you remove that stress, you then get this rebound where performance starts to rise again. And optimizing that recovery is absolutely fundamental to the rebound of that performance. And so all of a sudden now then what happens is that, and again, it comes back to what we said about earlier, and that is about communication and about trust, is that what people have to then do is trust the fact that recovery is going to help them perform, because they're sat doing nothing. And how can that possibly be positive for performance? But equally, it's the same for the business when we're talking about healthy lifestyles, healthy approaches. Is by saying, if you're more physically active through the day, to some extent it's a recovery from being at the desk. But that recovery piece, that physical activity, is going to make have a profound impact on your performance when you are at the desk.
Yeah.
And so I think it's changing that culture. And again, business is the same. It's board down. It can't, as soon as the board don't believe it, all of a sudden that influence is going to drip right through the business. So I think actually it's about addressing what's going on at the top to make sure that what happens across the industry changes.
I couldn't agree more. And there was a few things bouncing around my mind there. You were chatting about the athlete, that maybe goes to a competition on a Sunday, doesn't perform particularly well, feels the pressure all night, doesn't sleep, but then gets up 6 a.m. on a Monday morning and goes for a 10-hour bike ride because that's the right thing to do, and hammer themselves because I think thinking that, well, I need to have a long day because obviously didn't perform particularly well. It's almost like back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, isn't it? Rather than knowing, well, actually, I probably need a day off my bike, need to recover properly, get my nutrition right, and then go again.
Well, do you know what? It's a great story on that, because I used to be a director of research at the British Olympic Medical Centre, so I looked after the prep of 5 Olympic teams. And I remember in Athens. No, it was in Tallahassee. I remember in Tallahassee, training camp out there. And I remember watching a coach once, and it took a group of athletes. They just arrived, so they're jet lagged. It was incredibly hot, very, very humid. Out they go for their session too early, not prepped. They should be recovering, but they went out for a session and did badly. And the response of the coach to that was, the following day was to beat them up in the training session, and was to punish them for not doing well the day before. And it was one of those ones that you sort of looked at, you thought, really? I mean, really? You think that's going to be helpful? And of course, for the subsequent 3 days after that, performance was through the floor, because the reason they performed badly wasn't because of lack of effort. It was environment that done it to them, And so I think it is making sure, again, it brings us back to what we said right at the very beginning about reflection. It's about reflect on why something has happened. And if you do that, you'll understand what the reasons were, and then you can make changes to those reasons, rather than just sort of taking this carte blanche approach, which is, as a business, we're not earning enough money. The way forward is just to work harder. Well, how many people have solved their turnover problem with just simply working harder? Because if it was that easy, everybody would be doing it. That's the point, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, from a business context, or even for guys, wherever you are within a business organization, is when you've got a problem, you very rarely solve the problem by staring at your screen for 12 hours and not moving. You solve it when you turn your conscious brain off, you step away from your computer, you go for the walk, you go to the toilet, whatever it is. Or at some point in the night when you're doing something automatic like a shower or making a cup of tea, it'll just come to you. It's because you've distracted yourself away from the problem. So you've let your brain, naturally work it out. And I think it's an experiment in itself, isn't it? Right, you've got a problem, you just got to stare at your screen for 12 hours, try and solve it. It's never going to happen. Just get that little break state, you know, let your natural brain chemistry kick in, and then I'm sure you'll come up with a solution.
And anybody's written a book, and I've written 8 books, will know that your best work is never done in the last 4 hours of an 8-hour day. I'll tell you that.
No, I can imagine it's not. You find your own little sweet spot.
Well, you know, the best writing I've ever done was out on the run.
Brilliant.
And that's the truth to it, you know. So I think you're right. But I think, you know, when it comes to that sort of the health aspect, I think it is about making small changes. It's across the piece. It is around activity. It's around nutrition. It's around things like smoking cessation and alcohol reduction. It's about optimizing sleep and recovery. It's about things like the gut microbiome. I did an awful lot around across lockdown, talking about immune health, you know, and because obviously COVID shone a spotlight on immune health. But I think many of the things we talk about in that are relatively easy things to do. They're not major lifestyle changes, but accumulated. You know, you've got that dreadful term, I don't particularly like it, this idea of marginal gains. But what we do is we accumulate these small changes, and when we bring them together, they can make they can have a profound impact on our health. And I think that's what we should be looking for, is just rather than trying to make one big change, which is very difficult to be consistent with. It's just about making lots of small changes to bring about an overall big change.
Yeah, and it's a different mindset shift, isn't it? When you're looking at, you know, again, 100% change or 101% changes, which one's going to have the biggest impact? Well, you're probably not going to stick to the 100% change because it's so far off where your center core is, for sure. Listen, Greg, we could chat for hours. I've got no doubt about that. But what I want to do before we finish is a little quick fire quiz, put you on the spot.
Okay.
Right, okay. You get to choose one, your favorite, and tell us why. Swim, run, or bike?
Swim. It's where I came from as a kid. I started swimming when I was 5, national champion at 11. But of late, and certainly since I started training David Williams for the channel back in 2006, I came across open water swimming, and it is for me the absolute panacea. If you want to escape, open water is where it's at.
Follow-up question. I didn't plan to put in any questions. I was going to do a quick fire.
Oh.
Have your open water swimming, have you linked any of that to sort of this cold water therapy that's obviously sort of a bit of a craze at the minute, and it has been for a couple of years, in terms of the science behind that's looking pretty strong, isn't it?
Yeah, very strong. And so towards the end of last year, towards the end of 2020, I, along with a colleague of mine, Mike Tipton, we wrote the expert statement on health and performance in the cold. I worked with Her Spirit, a charity for women, and what we did is we set the winter swim challenge for them, which was effectively 10 minutes of open water swimming every week across the winter. Really a properly tough challenge. And we've done an awful lot around actually things like pain reduction, some interesting work around pain reduction and cold open water swimming, around various brain proteins, one in particular which is linked to Alzheimer's and the role of that in cold open water swimming. And I think actually there's some really great work, and a lot of why I push it is actually around mental health. There's some really nice work showing improved mental health, and actually a treatment for disorders like depression, certainly mood disturbance, where cold open water swimming can have a really profound effect. So it is a great medium, but off the back of all of that, what I would say is that what's critical is you do it safely.
Yeah, of course.
Safety is key.
Brilliant. Okay, back to the quick fire quiz. I
Go
got
on.
distracted. Sporting hero?
Oh, that is a tough one. Honestly, my dad.
Brilliant. Non-sporting hero?
These are tough questions, man. These are tough questions. Non-sporting hero. Wow. Come back to me on that one. Go to the next one. I'll have a think.
It might be the same answer as the question before. Proudest moment?
I won a silver medal at the World Modern Pentathlon Championships in 1994. And it was my proudest moment because my dad watched it.
Oh, amazing, amazing. Your next big goal, personal?
Next big goal is planning at the moment to swim the tidal Thames 135 miles as quickly as possible. So we're sort of aiming for circa 3 days to set a new record.
Is that for 2021?
2021, summer 2021, yeah. So this summer, yeah.
Brilliant.
We had planned it for last year, but sadly we couldn't do it. There you go.
I think we've covered a million of these, but what's your top 3 tips for a healthy lifestyle?
Be more active more often. Doesn't matter what it is, movement counts. So it could be just walking around the block, it could be taking the stairs, but just more active more often. I think when it comes to diet, eat the rainbow and make it yourself. And I think thirdly is respect recovery, optimize sleep, and make sure you take time to recover.
We could have another podcast just on sleep, because that's fascinating in a minute, and that for performance gain. So I'll come back to it then. Non-sporting hero.
My mum.
Balanced it up. Love it.
Well, yeah, I mean, she was an absolute legend. I would never be where I am today without either my mum or dad.
Brilliant. And I'm sure that'll resonate with a lot of people listening today. Greg, thanks very much. As always, we could speak for hours, but I appreciate your time. And I'm sure the guys have engaged with this. For those that are listening, we've put all Greg's contact details in the comments below and in the bio for this podcast. And yeah, great. Hopefully we can catch up again next year, mate. I really appreciate it. I love chatting to you.
I really look forward to it. Thanks for having me on. It's always great to chat.
No, thanks very much, mate.